Okay, hi everybody, and welcome. My name's Justine Clark. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many countries on which we're meeting today and recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I'm speaking today from the lands of the Greater Kulin Nation, and I recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded. We pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to First Nations people joining us here today. So welcome to Parlour Lab number 8. We're delighted to be going for 8 months now, that means. The series is convened by Carly Marnane, Rebecca McLaughlan and Amanda Ahmadi, and we also thank Macarena de la Vega de Leon for her work in setting the series up. So today our hosts are Carly and Rebecca. Rebecca's joining us as host for the first time. She is a Australian Research Council DECRA Research Fellow at the University of Newcastle, and her research looks at the perception and use of healthcare spaces to inform architectural practice. Many of you will have seen her excellent presentation as part of lab number 3, and if you didn't, I urge you to head to our website or YouTube channel and watch it. It was a really fantastic session, and we're delighted to have Rebecca join the team, so welcome. So we're going to start today with 2 short presentations from our speakers, followed by a discussion led by Carly and Rebecca. We welcome questions from the audience. As you know, most Parlour events are very interactive, and we really enjoy that conversation that happens through the ether and through that chat box. It's nice to just have a sense of being together. So I'd like to hand over to Carly now to kick off today's event, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Welcome, Carly.
Thank you, Justine. Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see all your faces. I can now introduce myself as Dr. Carly Marnane. My PhD was just conferred. Yay! I think actually we might have started Parlour Lab just when I'd submitted my thesis. It took like 6 months to get marked and stuff, but now I can say I'm Dr. Carly Marnane, working at the University of Queensland here in Meanjin or Brisbane. So thanks everyone for being here. Today we're talking about the concept of resilience in the built environment. And the need for resilience is probably fairly obvious with everything going on in the world at the moment and with many of us locked down right now. I thought it would be helpful just to define resilience before our speakers begin. Merriam-Webster defines resilience as an ability to recover or adjust easily to misfortune or change. Brené Brown, one of my favorite social scientists, says that joy collected over time fuels resilience, ensuring we'll have reservoirs of emotional strength when hard things do happen. So what does that mean for architecture? I think this is a really interesting question that we're going to explore today with 2 amazing speakers that we have here to discuss this topic. We've got Dr. Rosemary Kennedy here in Brisbane and Dr. Temitope Egbelakin speaking from Newcastle. So let me take a moment to introduce you to them just now. So our second speaker today is Dr. Rosemary Kennedy. Rosie is a practicing architect and researcher who's passionate about place-based, climate-responsive architecture and urban design, particularly in tropical and subtropical cities like Brisbane. She researches the impacts of inner urban high-density living, planning for sea level rise, informal settlements, post-disaster reconstruction and inclusive environments. Formerly, Rosie led the research, community engagement and teaching at the QUT Centre for Subtropical Design, and she now runs the Subtropical Cities Consultancy to collaborate with planning, architecture and urban development organisations to complement their climate responsive approaches to city design and architecture. So thanks so much for being here today and sharing your research and industry experience with us, Rosemary. Before we hear from Rosie, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Temitope Egbelakin is an associate professor at the University of Newcastle. Dr. Temi was awarded a Master of Science in Construction Management from the National University of Singapore and a Doctor of Philosophy in Civil Engineering from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. So fantastic international experience. Dr. Temi's research addresses challenges in the policy and practice of building community resilience to disasters. And she's involved in so many different projects if you've seen her website. There are 2 I'd like to highlight just now. Dr. Temi is the Executive Director of CFAL Newcastle, which is an organisation that delivers learning solutions related to United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, public health strategies and disaster risk reduction. And in recent news, Dr. Temi and her team have been awarded funding for a project to support women working in construction trades in Latin America to increase their workforce participation and collectively help to attract and retain underutilised talent, which is super awesome. So thank you for being here today and sharing your wealth of experience and knowledge, Dr. Temi. So I'd like you to invite you, Dr. Temi, to share your screen and kick off today's session. So today, Dr. Temi will be talking about whether we're prepared for cultural heritage and cascading natural disasters. Welcome, Temi.
Thank you so much, Carly. Just a bit of disclaimer, I've stepped down as the Executive Director of CFAL so that I can focus on more research. I'm sorry. I'm not sure whether this, the website has been updated. I wanted to do more research and a little bit of engagement. Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you, special thank you again for the invitation to speak at this Parlor Lab. I didn't know anything about it until you actually sent me an email. I was like, wow. Then going through all the presentations, I said, this is one of the environment, you know, as a woman that I want to be part of. And actually, I was trained as an architect, and I worked as an architect in different countries. I served in Singapore. Why I got an interest in disaster was because I was involved in post-disaster reconstruction in Banda Aceh after the 2004 disasters, where I was managing and designing a lot of projects. Then then I wanted to understand, you know, why people don't mitigate or provide mitigations in their building. Then I found myself in New Zealand. So that is just the little background to that. So today I'm practically involved in a lot of projects. And I'm just going to be talking about cultural heritage and cascading disasters in Australia. For us, this is just a research idea that we just put together. We are putting the stakeholders together just to give us an overview of what it is in Australia, where we are, and where we should be going to in the next coming decade if we want to protect our heritage. So we all understand what natural disasters are. We've seen it, we've experienced it. We know it both affects our communities, we as human beings, and also our built environment which includes places, you know, that community cherish, especially when it talks about, you know, past achievement, historical tribulations and cultural heritage and sites, and we all hold it down, hold it to our hearts, and also wants the next generation or coming generation to be able to see where we are coming from, where we are today, and where we'll be going in the future. But Australia has been involved in a lot of disasters where a lot of these are heritage sites and buildings has been destroyed. And you can see some of the pictures here where we have bushfire being destroying a lot of heritage sites. We have the flooding, we have the cyclone, and then also I put a picture of the Newcastle earthquake. I live in Newcastle, so I put a picture of the Newcastle earthquake of some of the damages that we've had and how some of our historic buildings and heritage has been lost. So I'm still I'm new in Australia, just 2.5 years old, just 2.5 years in Australia. So I started thinking about, you know, where is Australia in terms of disaster, in terms of the global realm? And quite fortunately, Australia is, you know, despite our small economy and our size, we have a huge number of share of disasters. If you look at what I have there, we've got earthquake, tropical cyclone is there. We've got pandemic, endemic, which we already have, storm, you know, extreme temperature, wildfire. We've got majority of all the disasters that, you know, that is available. And then also I looked at the economic impact, which I was able to get some data from insured losses from natural hazard. This is just for Australia. You could see that we have lows and lows and lows of economic losses from disasters. And then New Zealand is a little bit far ahead of Australia when you talk about disaster risk preparedness. And I know that in Australia, there are a lot of new frameworks that have recently been developed in the last 5 years in terms of disaster risk reduction and also adopting a lot of the international frameworks. But with all this development since in the last 10 years, after we have that last big bushfire, we still haven't learned more. We still haven't gone far in terms of preparing for disaster. From my own little investigation, I've seen that there's still a repeat of a lot of the mistakes, a lot of the issues are still being repetitive, despite the losses, despite the experience, and despite all the knowledge that we have. And also, these are pictures from the current Black Summer bushfire, where we have lots of heritage properties being also burnt down. And what I noticed, because I was invited to do a review of the cleanup for the heritage, some of these heritage buildings. And what I noticed that a lot of people that were involved in the cleanup, in the assessment, have little or no knowledge about, how do we handle, how do we restore, or how do we even assess heritage buildings after a fire damage or even after a flooding damage. So what we found was that a lot of buildings were being pulled down without even assessing whether there is possibility of restoring this building. We have similar case in New Zealand after Christchurch, but we learned a lesson where a lot of buildings were being pulled down immediately after the earthquake, but we actually stopped. There was a mandate from Heritage New Zealand that actually stopped them from further damaging of this building. But in Australia, even after the Victoria bushfire and also the Black Summer bushfire, the same thing has actually repeated itself. It's a decade, 10 years, we are still repeating our mistakes. And then also we started seeing that the damage is not just to heritage. Also, we're looking at about the heritage both in the coral reefs, in the sea, and also in the forest. A lot of these heritage sites are being damaged. 10 high World Heritage in New Zealand, World Heritage sites in Australia now is being highlighted by the World Heritage Council as being at risk of damage from different natural disasters, including climate change. So, and we all know that climate change is also increasing. It's increasing the impact of these disasters. And it's been, there's data that climate change is going to increase the frequency of all these natural disasters, both in terms of frequency and in terms of intensity, which means that where we are now in the next couple of years or in the next decade, we're going to have more and more and more of these natural disasters. So my question is, where did we get it wrong? Or what are those things that we have not been doing in Australia? Or what are those lessons that we have not learned and adopted in Australia to make sure that we are where we're supposed to be in terms of protecting our cultural heritage? Then I started digging into different frameworks that are available in Australia for heritage management, risk reduction. We've got all of them. We've got international, we've got the Sendai framework, we've got Paris Agreement, we've got the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, we've got the heritage conservation, everything we have there. So where is this missing link? And also looked at different organizations that are operating in this space. That we have heaps of them. So the next thing I started thinking about is there is something missing here. Why? We have technology. We have all the technology. We have the research, we have the experience, we have the bushfire, we have loads of this technology through CSIRO, through the natural hazard, CRC. We have the regulations in place, even though a lot of time they are not being implemented. I can tell you, looking at some of the buildings in Newcastle that are built after the earthquake, a lot of them are not compliant, even to earthquakes, to earthquakes code and policies, which I'm still a little bit shocked with. So we have all this policy in place, but at the moment, from my own personal assessment or my own opinion, is that the adoption of mitigation measures to actually preserve this heritage building is still missing. So where is the gap? So what I found out at the end of the day with looking at just doing this assessment is that disaster resilience and heritage preservation is actually a multidimensional issue that requires a multidimensional approach. Heritage conservationists cannot say we can do it by ourselves. Disaster resilience team cannot say we can do it by ourselves. The built environment team cannot say we can do it by ourselves. It has to be a multidimensional approach, which means all these teams come together to actually find a way holistically to actually address these issues. So we started looking at different gaps. So the first one is that we look at the building heritage, the heritage building, the heritage site itself. What are those things that actually impede, restoring these buildings? First, there are economic issues, which is huge. A lot of times, when you want to restore an heritage building or a site, it becomes economically unviable because of the property value. So you spend a lot of money in this building, yet the value of this property it doesn't increase. Then the owner, especially when it's not the government, then becomes, how do I get my money out of this building if I invest so much money in this building? Then there are a lot of socio-cultural issues also that are involved. We have regulatory issues where strengthening a particular aspect of a beam or a particular aspect of the building can actually impede the heritage properties of that building. Those overlaps are also there that are conflicting. Also, we have environmental issues. Then the usability of the building. What are we going to use the building for? If we're going to spend $3 million of this building, how do we recoup the money? What is the, because a lot of time when you do strengthening, it actually reduces this, the lettable space of this building or the space available. So there are a lot of issues that needs to be looked at. Then the second thing that we also thought about is, I'm not sure whether you can see this, is the stakeholders interaction and operative environment. There are a huge number of stakeholders that are involved. You could see that we put property owners, which could be public or the sector in the middle. Financial institutions have a role to play here where they make funds available for property owners. The insurance industry, they're one of also the key players. If you invest 3 million or 10 million into restoring a building and it becomes uninsurable, then what is the essence of investing that money? So they also have a part to play. Then we look at valuation. How does valuation happen for heritage buildings? It's also important. Then we look at different government organizations. We look at industry groups. What are the roles of all these players? How can we pull them together? How can we all come together to make sure that our heritage is preserved and as well as they become profitable? If not profitable, at least they could manage themselves. Then so we summed up all these gaps in terms of research gaps, which we actually termed improving disaster resilience of heritage. And then we looked at the multidisciplinary approach, which I've just explained. And then also we are ongoing. We are examining different policy measures and incentives that are actually available. And we found that a lot of these incentives are not enough to actually, strengthen this building or to bring them up to the current policies. So what a lot of building owners or property owners, including our government itself, is to allow a lot of these sites or buildings to actually continue to decay. If there are buildings in the city, they allow them to continue to decay until they are able to save only the facade. And this is very common. It's a common practice where the buildings is lost and they only save the facade. I've seen a lot of that in Melbourne and even here in Newcastle and in Sydney. So in a nutshell, with all the practices, if we are not careful, we're going to lose all our heritage buildings when it comes to a lack of incentives and financial and economic incentives. Then we also look at because of the increasing coastal erosion. So this is a new project that we're doing with Victoria Council, where we're actually looking at heritage risk preparedness for coastal erosion. At the moment, we are doing heritage risk mapping and vulnerability assessment. So we're looking at a lot of their buildings, doing what we call rapid assessment or we call desktop assessment to actually identify which of these buildings are at risk, and then develop a matrix for them to say, this is high risks and low risks and minimal risks. And then we are looking at community prioritization. Because it's the states and community, the local government are going to be spending this money, which buildings, what exactly is important to them? How do they define the loss or the preservation of heritage building? So what they've asked us to come up with is a model to engage with communities after we've understand what is it that is important to communities, especially during the disaster event, and also after the disaster event. What exactly do they want to spend their money on? So that is the bit of work that we're doing in this space. So the proposed outcome of our research is that we cannot achieve resilience by itself in terms of a heritage building. We have to be able to strike the right balance between life safety risk, cost, preservation of the built heritage, even our emergency response, how we respond to saving these buildings is also very important. The time frames, because we cannot afford to wait long, because a lot of the policies does not specify time frames for strengthening. So the more we continue to wait or we adopt that tactics, the more the disasters happen and the more we lose a lot of this building. And also practicability. We are not saying that it is possible to save all these heritage buildings or heritage sites, but whatever methods engineers are proposing has to be practical and has to be sustainable. So this is just a snapshot of what I do. And I just want to say thank you all for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Temi. I feel like my mind has been blown in a really big way. I didn't know that we had all of these policies, but they're not being enacted, actually.
They are enacted, but they are enacted in different ways solely. They don't overlap. So a lot of their objectives and targets don't overlap. So everybody's just there doing their thing. And you can't make a decision without actually coming together to see how your own decision affects my decision. It's just like an architect. involving and heritage conservation. You cannot say, oh, I'm going to reserve this particular wall or this particular facade without thinking about the engineering solutions, or even without thinking of health and safety issues, without thinking of access as well. You know, we have disability access, we have all that, we have plumbing, like a lot of issues that are interwoven. And if only we practitioners working in this space begin to see how we can, you know, work together rather than argue and fight each other, then things might work better.
Yeah, so to become more resilient, we need to work together. Thank you so much, Temi. That was awesome. If you could stop your screen sharing, and then I'll ask Rosie to share your screen. Today, Rosie's going to be talking about thinking outside the building. So thank you, Rosie.
Welcome, everyone, especially those of you in lockdown. My heart really goes out to you in this context. Now, when Carly invited me to join this conversation, I was a little bit surprised, thinking that designing for disasters isn't really my core business. But then I thought, look, most of what I do is about getting people to work together on solutions to mitigate potential disasters. So I think this is really quite a good segue from what Temi has just spoken about. I'm concerned about how design can meet the climate and societal challenges coming towards us. And my ongoing research-led practice focuses continuously on these challenges through the lenses of climate, landscape, and lifestyle in local places. So these themes in my research have converged in specific research projects around high-density residential environments and climate-based sustainable design guidance, mostly focused on what sustainable urbanism can be. This publication brought together 5 years of research and intensive industry collaboration across a spectrum of urban settings, and continues to influence Queensland government policy and municipal planning schemes, and new sets of design guidelines keep coming out. Yet we're a long way from getting it right. As South East Queensland's population has grown and expanded, suburban tract development has sprawled. Cities are getting hotter and noisier and dirtier as open space and cooling vegetation give way to insular buildings that rely on energy for habitability. So landscape pervades the subtropical imagination, but in reality, it's rarely prioritised and implemented in the urban development process. Finding solutions to complex problems requires both objective knowledge and a high level of creative intuition. So one of the ways to do this is to bring diverse disciplines together to do more than we could alone. I frequently use the intensive design charrette as a research method which can both build and share knowledge. This method has a lot going for it in that it produces a lot of rich data that can be analysed thematically, including notes and dialogue, sketches, diagrams and video. So today I'm just going to briefly share 3 examples. All are documented in online repositories if you want to view further details about them. The central Queensland city of Rockhampton frequently experiences devastating river flooding, and the council had proposed a 7.5 kilometre long levee to protect a low-lying part of the city. The Rockhampton's Resilient Future charrette investigated ways to empower the whole community beyond the engineering solution. The process produced consensus around a series of hardware principles to mediate between the broader ecological landscape and urban living and deliver benefits to the community every day, not just during flood events. The design strategies and spatial concepts were built around 3 alternatives: to defend through construction of a levee, to adapt by designing to accommodate periodic flooding or to retreat, so a long-term view to relocate population in flood-prone areas. In this workshop, 3 disciplinary or transdisciplinary groups led by experienced designers, urban designers in the main, participated with Rockhampton's Mayor and Chief Planner. So what I like about the design-led charrette method is that it utilises expert knowledge in the design process and is fantastic at identifying and resolving competing issues and interests of multiple stakeholders. The charrettes I devise often include a majority of participants who've never experienced an integrative and iterative design process before, including the improbably ambitious Slum-Free India workshop. This was an exploratory in-house workshop at QUT to gain an understanding of and experience in the issues facing the Indian government in addressing the complex problem of rehousing 90 million people living in India's informal urban settlements, and to develop some initial ideas of how innovation in research and practice could be applied to the problem. It took a slightly different approach with team leaders from urban design, public health, and construction management fields, though every team included landscape architects and architects. The process inspired a sense of shared purpose amongst a diverse group of research disciplines and built participants' knowledge of each other's capacity. It ultimately led to a $3 million multi-organisation grant submission to the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund. One of my most productive and enduring research partnerships is with a leading social scientist, Professor Laurie Byes. I collaborated with her in 2020 at the DMA Engineers and UQ Healthy Ageing Initiative on the Longevity by Design Challenge. With Australia's population rapidly ageing, 1 in 4 of us will be over 65 by 2050, and life expectancy is 87 years of age. How do we reimagine the built and natural environment to ensure older people's participation in the country's social and economic life? It's not business as usual anymore. We partnered with Redlands City and used this scenario. It's 2050 and Redlands is renowned the world over as the best place to live for people of all ages. We use this to get people thinking differently about the future they want to be part of. Redlands is a water city, and this also presented opportunities for proposing new models for Australia's urbanised coast under threat of rising sea levels. The process challenged people to ask what it takes to create visionary, innovative, and highly connected communities. But no overnight sensations were allowed in the process, only change within realistic constraints. 121 people from more than 60 private and community-based organisations, government bodies, and educational institutions took part, and many were truly challenged and confronted, particularly those in the current retirement village industry. The results were inspiring, and most had young people at the heart of engaged intergenerational communities in 2050 and had tested the roadmap to get there. The wins for me and the Longevity by Design team were that we were able to engage non-designers in the design-led research process, build their confidence in the collaborative process, and demonstrate that collaborative problem solving can create solutions that represent transformative change. So how are these examples relevant to resilience? As the world heads toward 10 billion people, it's urbanising and ageing. By 2050, 7.5 billion of us will be living in cities and getting older. China's over 65 population alone will exceed 200 million people by mid-century. So to make room and prepare for another 2.2 billion people to live safely and with dignity is a huge design problem. Our job as architects is to think outside the building in the 21st century to improve rather than to exacerbate situations, and to create cities that are livable, just, transformed and green. Architects are the three-dimensional thinkers with the skills to question the status quo and help the community visualise positive change. We're the professional integrators, and we can and must play a more strategic role in urban reform by collaborating with our counterparts across a series of industries, but particularly in the development industry, to innovate on ways to transform high density living and cities. That's it, Carly.
I'll jump in now. Rosie, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Both of the presentations today have been so topical. Firstly, because I'm actually writing up a paper about a transdisciplinary teaching course we tried to do that was both amazing and be quite painful. So it's really great to have confirmation that actually this is the way forward, even if it's really hard to do. I also grew up in Christchurch, so the idea of losing cultural heritage is pretty central to how I feel about things. So I guess my first question is, these are not new issues, right? Yet we see this business as usual approach just being pervasive. And so the question, I guess, is around what it's going to take to trigger change. And my first question is in regards to social heritage. And Rosie, you talked about collaborating with social scientists, but also Temi, it seems relevant to your work as well. Is there space where perhaps some social science research could better articulate the value of cultural heritage to shift that financial discussion towards one that's more about human well-being and you know, how we occupy the world and how important those buildings are to us as people?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the collaboration between social science and design is one of the strongest things that we can actually do. We can, as architects, we're really not very influential people at all, but we can actually help people to visualise what the future can be. And my experience of working with social scientists is that they actually get it, but they realise that they're not designers, and that we do need to work together to bring these issues to the fore and to take a really sort of a positive approach to showing people that it can actually work, a positive and optimistic approach.
Temi, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. I think there's been a lot of effort in the research space in trying to understand how do we measure those social values. But it's been very hard for social scientists to be able to actually say these are the social values in terms of actually saying this is in terms of ranking or in terms of adding a particular percentage to it, because it all stems from, you know, how we feel or our attitude or behaviors in this part. So this has been very difficult. I want to go back to when we were talking about Christchurch. When Christchurch earthquake happened in 2010, 2010-11, nobody was thinking about the issues of mental health as a result of the earthquake. But 10 years down the line, we begin to see those kids that were affected, the social impact and the health impacts now came in. We saw the kids that were affected, and then we could see even the adults. Even I've got a couple of friends that live in Christchurch at that time, and they still have that panic and all that. So now with experience, now we begin to see the data and we begin to see how they overlap. And one of the things that, you know, that always stops us in our tracks when it comes to, you know, understanding the social impact or economic impact or any other impact or assessment of the social values, because people tend to forget about disaster impacts. So once the whole idea of disaster goes and there's another story or there's another disaster, we forget. I'll give an example of, then we stop the whole work that we're doing and then we move on. I'll give an example that we have in Australia. You know, last year we're talking about the bushfire, Then we had the flooding. Before we could even recover or even put together the research agenda, we had another bushfire. Then before we even complete that, we have another pandemic. So it's the cascading effect is overwhelming for researchers. I can't say that for myself because it's difficult for us to, to align all this research in terms of the cascading effect and actually taking time to measure the resilience until we have a pause naturally in this atmosphere. That is when we'll now say, okay, we want to develop vulnerability index and all that. But at this stage, I can tell you that it's difficult to actually measure those impacts. And we are not the one who is going to take the decision. It's the policymakers. It is the government. Without the data, it is going to be very hard for us to actually prove a point because they will not spend so much money on a disaster they cannot envisage, even though they have previous experience.
I mean, that's a really great point. So my sister's an assistant principal in Christchurch and they're still dealing with all those behavioural issues of primary school kids. And the difficulty is, how do you link that research to the built environment in a convincing way? I guess returning to something that architects do on a daily basis and can do, I'm thinking about, there's a lot of really beautiful examples of fire resilient architecture. So I was thinking of Simon Anderson's holiday home in the Blue Mountains that was published recently. Or one of my favorite cocktail bar fit outs is on the lakefront in Queenstown, and the whole thing's designed so if they know the lake's going to flood, they can unbolt all of it and store it upstairs. So given that we can do these beautiful things, I mean, should we be trying to leverage more of that to advocate for clients to get on board with this way of thinking?
I think we can, and it's a case of, look, I asked Ken Yang, some people will know Ken Yang from Malaysia, about what motivates him. And he said, basically, we have to do it by example. It's very difficult to find clients sometimes, well, most of the time, unless they can actually see and touch the benefit in it for them in terms of their bottom line. But again, architects are the visualizers. So just in terms of designs and beautiful designs that can be dismantled. I've recently visited a public open space that's actually privately leased in Brisbane. Looks like it's been there forever, looks like it will be there forever, but it's beneath a rail overpass in the inner city, and it's an open place and anybody can visit. Beautiful garden. But that took 5 years of negotiation to literally get the agreement of the government authorities involved, because the space is owned by Queensland Rail, and at any time, if something happens to that infrastructure, then they want access to it. That whole space has been designed to be dismantled within a few short hours if that authority ever needs access. So this is where designers working together, and in that case, the authorities, architects and landscape architects working with property developers with a long-term vision actually made it happen. So I don't think they really advertise the fact. So most people wouldn't realise it's something, that little cocktail bar or where they can buy coffee can actually just be picked up and moved away. So innovation in this space it's pretty exciting, and it's really got a massive amount of potential.
We have an audience question, actually. We have a few comments and questions. I was wondering if we might throw to density and kind of the challenges of city living.
The title I gave my little introduction was Thinking Outside the Building. And one of the biggest failings, I think, is that all of us have to be or haven't been custodians of our external environment. So in terms of the high density living and the apartment buildings that I do research on, these buildings literally have to do everything now. In Queensland, for example, we do love outdoor living and we love balconies, but they're really not sort of places that you can use so much because of the noise outside, because of the dust. And what is all of that? That is an enormous amount of traffic and lack of trees and so on. So we've become very insular. We've got more and more regulations. Those buildings become energy dependent. And when things like the 2011 flood occurs or any other event that causes an outage, they're pretty much uninhabitable. So the existing built environment and the future, if we keep going along the same way that we are now, we've got an enormous amount of wasted resource and buildings that few people will be able to afford to live in and will not be habitable. So I know what I'd prefer. I'd prefer to be able to throw open the windows, and enjoy living in the city. One of the some of the research that I did with an ARC project some time ago found that people do really like those inner city living because of the vibrant life on the streets that's available. But we need to make those street level and what's happening outside buildings a lot more habitable.
Temi, did your work overlap with density at all? And does the idea of resilience or resilient thinking about cultural heritage and what buildings to preserve and what communities like and need, does the density of that community change that response at all?
It does change, but the complication is that, okay, how do I put it? So I'll give you because I did a lot of this work in New Zealand. I'll give you an example of Auckland. When you have in fast moving or I would say expensive cities, what people, rather than strengthening those buildings, what they would do is to actually pull it down, convert it to a car park for another 10 years or 5 years until they can get a building approval. So, and I think there was a time Auckland Council introduced what they call transferable development rights, so that if you don't need to pull down your building, but because of the density and the heights, you're allowed to transfer the right to somebody else. And in terms of economic incentives, it did work for a couple of years, but after a while, people just think it's not enough. I rather prefer to actually have a skyscraper and all that. And then they just, they just can't adopt the demolition by neglect. They have about 30 years to strengthen the building. And Auckland is a low, what do you call it, a low seismic zone. So there's no reason for them to do anything. And we have the same problem in smaller towns as well. I did a couple of work in Wanganui in New Zealand, where that is even worse because a lot of the city is actually dying, and because of migration and all that. So in terms of heritage, it doesn't matter whether it's high density or low density. It all boils down to, can I afford to strengthen this building? Can I afford to hold on to this building? And even if I want to afford to hold on to this, how can the architects and the engineers help me not to reduce the lettable space? Because if engineers and architects come up with, innovations that are sustainable, cost-effective, and then doesn't reduce your lettable space in terms of density, then the probability that they're going to pull down the building, it's lower. In a lot of cases, we don't have those, those possibilities because one has to go for the other. So, in terms of trade-off, then we find a way of, going around it.
Yeah, so that problem-solving ability that we have becomes so important. I think we have time for one more audience question, so we might go to Lucy Burke-Smith. Lucy, if you're there, about regulations and governments and things.
I suppose to everyone from a very cold, chilly, snowy Tasmania. I suppose it wasn't much a question, but an observation on some of the experiences that I've had in working with various different government agencies in heritage portfolio management and how they've really been, I guess, trying to both support the community, but also to protect their individual portfolio. So in the message that I put into the chat, I mentioned for Temi's information that Public Works New South Wales and the Government Architect's Office used to have a disaster preparedness unit, you know, a truck and everything. And the engineers would, you know, bundle on in whenever there'd been a disaster to go ahead and try and provide some support to assessing, you know, at-risk structures following events or at-risk environments to balance some of those considerations about, you know, the post-disaster risk and the mitigating measures in the interests of protecting, you know, community values and cultural values. But it's also been interesting for me working within that sort of, within that field, to see that some of the best lessons learned for heritage asset portfolio managers have really come from that museums and gallery sector, where, you know, they have quite well-structured disaster preparedness strategies for their collections, and that ultimately some of those things can really roll through and inform strategies for the built heritage environment, which is, you know, the area that I work within. But prior to my current role, I worked down at the Port Arthur Historic Sites Management Authority, and following the bushfires, the Denali bushfires a number of years ago, they started to implement a disaster preparedness strategy, and that sort of extended to the build assets, but also to the natural values, because they manage quite a number of natural values with some of those sea level rises and coastal erosion. But it's also led to some really interesting research as well as some grant funding for digitisation of archives and the like as well, because with many of these assets, there is a considerable collection of, you know, either furniture or artwork, or indeed, you know, the data, you know, the really important historic information that's equally at risk. So I think the response is really diverse, as Temi has pointed out, and it really does speak to, I guess, the extent that multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary input needs to be.
Yeah, that comment about data is quite interesting. Temi, has digitisation come up as an important part of this preserving cultural heritage?
Yes, it actually did come up. It's just that we didn't get the funding when we applied last year. So I think we had a discussion with Blue Sheet. So what we learned is that even for buildings, it's quite easy because you can itemize them, you know where they are, and then you can do it with. So what we discussed then was that all those buildings, we will start having, you know, them in 3D scans, and so that even if a particular area is damaged, we can rebuild them back to where they are. And then also to actually look at having a geospatial analysis of all the heritage sites, you know, where they are, the location, because sometimes if we don't know where they are, the extent or the what do you call it? Is it the dimension or extent or where they are? And after a bushfire happens, we don't know, you know, they are just lost. The territory are lost, and every valuable items on the site are lost. So hopefully we're going to apply again next year if we can actually get funding to be able to actually use what do you call it? To actually do digitalization, to actually fly, what do you call these cameras again?
So GIS.
Yeah, GIS. Yeah, so you actually use GIS to actually now do all the mapping for both the buildings as well as all the sites, and actually now have a 3D print copy of all those, what do you call, of all the portfolios, so that if a particular area of a building is damaged, you know, we can actually restore it, or we can have a mock model being put in there. So that we're hoping to apply again next year if we could get the funding.
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. Rosie, did you have anything to add? I think we had a really interesting discussion about fast and slow disasters, and that they might actually need a very different kind of response.
Well, Temi's already brought up mental health, for example, and what community in Australia hasn't had some kind of catastrophe, particularly natural disasters in the last decade or so. And then, you know, just looking at the nightly news this week and what's been happening with deluges in the northern hemisphere, that would be us. You know, we just had mobs of cattle who were drowned rather than lots of people, and those historic town centres and so on and so forth destroyed. Just terrifying.
Mm.
Yeah, so I'm kind of sort of wanting people to think about other kinds of slow-moving disasters. Like if we don't design our built environments to include everybody, you know, people depending on their age or ability. Most of the way that we set up our urban environments in Australia at the moment probably is fine for about, you know, 35% of the population, people who have got cars to drive to our far-flung suburbs and so on. So we've got this kind of very individualised way of going about the built environment. And even low density makes it difficult for people to participate because that, for example, that street that I showed in my last slide, how far apart are the ways that you can actually cross that street? People live and work on both sides of that, but there's this massive barrier that stops people from being able to participate. So I think during the pandemic, more and more of us have experienced what isolation is like, but for a lot of people, that is their life. And, you know, that's a kind of a disaster that we could really work a lot harder to avoid. And I just wanted to say that one of the entrenched beliefs in society, or at least in property development, is that yield and profit are, you know, the be all and end all, the only thing that measures success. But if we have a look at our friends, Woha in Singapore, for example, they've developed 5 different indices that they use to measure their own projects, and they invite others to do the same. And one of those measures is, or one of the indicators is civic generosity. What does that project, that precinct give, or well, basically give to the environment around? What is its ecological contribution? What's its self-sufficiency and so on? So if we started, all of us, all sectors started to use those kinds of indices instead of the net to gross ratio, then, you know, there might actually be quite a major mind shift. I like to think that way, but you know,
Yeah, so that
be optimistic.
Yeah, so important to expand our definition of success, also our definition of disasters, and kind of use this collaborative problem solving tools that you're both, Temi and Rosie, demonstrating to kind of build this resilience. We've only got 2 minutes left, and there are so many incredible questions in the chat, and that Rebecca and I have lined up, but we don't have time for them. Maybe we'll have to get you both back. So we might wrap up with a very quick rapid fire question of what is a key takeaway or a key message that you'd like to leave our audience with today. I might start with you, Rosie, and then finish on Dr. Temi.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess the key message is we're all in this together. So, and for us designers, we've got to exceed the acceptable solution. So, you know, when you're thinking about regulations, they're all about acceptable solutions. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
We got to be better.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Rosie. Temi, what's your message that you'd like to leave us with?
Okay, I wrote something down just now, so I'm just going to read that out if
Awesome.
that's okay. So learning from disasters is very critical, especially for the built environment. And in the heat of the moment, we have the opportunity to observe what is working and what is not working, and for who, and for, you know, and for whom. You know, in times of this crisis, it is worth recognizing that the future of our research and practice cut across various domains of resilience and adaptations, and also will be redefined in the next decade from different perspectives. So it's going to be totally different from what we know. This is just my own postulation that, you know, the way we think about resilience, adaptation, and design is going to be different, you know, and will be redefined, you know, from different perspectives in the next coming decade. We just have to keep learning and, you know, keep watching.
Well, I think my understanding of resilience has already changed after this hour. So I think you might be spot on there, Temi. Thank you so much, Rosie and Temi and Rebecca and Justine and all of the audience for being here today. This has been such a fantastic session, and I feel like I've learned so much. And yeah, my understanding of disasters has and resilience to those disasters has really expanded. So thank you to the University of Queensland and Sahans for supporting Parlour Lab. Thanks to all of Parlour's partners for your support of our activities and events. Thanks, Justine, for your ongoing support of the lab series, Rebecca for co-hosting with me today, Sarah for your work behind the scenes in setting up the event, to our amazing speakers, Rosie and Temi, and to you, our wonderful, wonderful audience, for asking such fabulous questions, and also all those fantastic comments in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to those today. The recording for this lab will be up online in a week or two, so we'll send you an email. And Justine's asked me to remind everyone to take the Wellbeing of Architects survey, Naomi's research, which we covered in lab number 3. So the link to that is on the Parlour website, and it'll be really helpful if everyone could do that. Justine, is it just open to practitioners at the moment?
No, it's open to everybody who is active in the built environment architecture profession. So practitioners, but also people working in allied fields, people who aren't trained as architects working within architecture. It's quite, they're taking a very broad definition, which of course is fabulous. There is going to be a separate one for students later, and a set of what are they called, focus groups for academics. So but yeah, anyone who's working in the kind of professional world, take the survey, please.
Awesome. Thank you.
And if you want to, you can go and watch Lab 03 on the website, which was Rebecca's fabulous presentation, which I already spoke about, and Naomi's presentation on that research. So, yeah.
Awesome. And as always, please be in touch if you have any comments or suggestions, or if there's a topic that you're burning to hear about. We always like to hear from you. So thank you everyone so much for your time. We really appreciate you being here with us today. Excited to hear about your research, Temi. It sounds really awesome.
Thank you.
When did you win that grant? Was it a grant that you said that you won?
No, it was a contract with Hunter Local Land Services and Victoria.
Cool.
So the one I was doing with Hunter Local Land Services, we were looking at evacuation centers for animal, and we're assessing the evacuation centers and looking at some of the remedial work that needs to be done, and also prioritizing some of the centers that are available that we could actually use for evacuation for animals, because the last flooding and bushfire, a lot of animals died, and then they said they wanted to get an understanding to make a decision of which centers should they prioritize. And funny enough, we discovered a lot of these centers that they do have are located in flood risk zone. Why do you have an emergency evacuation center in Cessnock? It's actually in the middle of the flood. And some of them are even prone to bushfire and all that. So we are kind of doing that analysis for them to see which center should we be investing money in. Yeah. Rather than just spending. Then there's one in, I can't remember, is it Dongon, that was on a hill? Yes, it's not affected by flooding, but the whole community get cut off during flooding and they can't get there. Yeah. So a lot of decisions that we made in Australia, sometimes I just love it. How did they make the decision to build an evacuation center here when people can't even access it?
So that work that we did in Rockhampton, and that was instigated by me because Rockhampton's my hometown, and I just heard that announced on the news, and I had just come back from Florida, where I was running a conference there, and there were a lot of speakers from New Orleans. And in New Orleans, we know that the levee failed during Hurricane Katrina. But on an everyday basis, every New Orleans person is paying like 20 cents an hour just to pump the water out. So the levee is constantly pumping. So it depends on fossil fuel energy to keep the water out. But because they're pumping the ground level has, it's reduced by something like some ridiculous amount, like 4 meters or something. The ground level is way below the sea level and the lake level. So, yeah.
And they put it all back in the same place.
Yeah.
It blows the mind, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's a little bit of that cultural heritage in a way too, because of the connection that people have to the place.
Yeah.